I had no clue what would snap first, my silence or my patience. My name is Alan Kemp. I'm 54 years old, and I've spent 25 of those years grinding my way to the top in logistics, running my own supply chain firm out of Jersey. My old man, Carl Kemp, a construction tycoon from upstate New York, never once acknowledged my work. He'd built highways and housing developments, laid concrete foundations that could be seen from the sky. Me, I moved boxes. That's how he saw it anyway. A month before the annual family barbecue, I went out and bought him a brand new Ford Raptor. It was the kind of truck he'd always talked about, big, loud, and built like a tank. I figured maybe, just maybe, he'd finally see me the way he saw himself. I had the keys delivered in a sleek black box with a bow on top. My company's logo was embossed on the tag, a subtle flex, but not enough to make it look like I was bragging. What Dad didn't know was that inside my glove box was a folded up DNA report. I'd ordered it on a restless night a couple of months back, just to answer questions I didn't even want to admit I had. The results were there in black and white, and they didn't say what I thought they would. I kept it tucked away like a live grenade, unsure if I'd ever actually pull the pin. I tried to forget about that report, focusing instead on the truck. I picked it up on a Friday morning, the summer sun making the fresh paint sparkle. I drove it off the lot and headed straight to Dad's place, a sprawling estate up in Albany that he'd built himself, brick by brick, like everything else in his life. The gravel crunched under the tires as I pulled up, my palms sweaty against the steering wheel. He wasn't expecting me, but I knew he'd be home. He was always there, overseeing something: tree trimming, driveway paving, endless improvements to a house that already looked like a monument. When I stepped out, he was in the garage, messing with an old riding mower that probably hadn't run since I was a kid. "Hey, Dad," I said, holding up the keys like an offering. He didn't even look up at first, just grunted, wiping his hands on a rag that was already dark with grease. Finally, he turned, his eyes landing on the truck. His eyebrows rose for half a second, then settled back into the usual line. "What's this, Al?" he asked, his voice as rough as the gravel under our feet. "It's for you," I said, trying to keep it light. "Figured you always talked about a real truck. Thought it was time you had one." He walked over slowly, his hand trailing along the polished fender. "Real nice," he muttered. "You buy this?" "Yeah," I said, swallowing hard. "Got a good deal through the company." He didn't say thank you, didn't smile, just nodded like he was evaluating a new piece of equipment for a job site. He asked about the engine, the towing capacity, all the things that didn't really matter. Then he looked back at me. "You sure you can afford this?" he asked, his eyes sharp. "Yeah, Dad," I said, my voice tight. "Business is good. Just signed a contract with a national freight client." He grunted again, stepping back like he'd seen enough. "Nice of you," he said finally, "but don't go thinking this makes up for anything." I didn't know what he meant by that, or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to admit it. My whole life, I'd been trying to make up for something, some invisible gap between me and the man who raised me, and I still didn't know what it was. The DNA report in the glove box felt heavier than ever as I watched him walk back into the garage, leaving the Raptor gleaming in the sun. I stood there a minute longer, feeling like a kid again, trying to earn a pat on the back that was never coming. The family barbecue was just a week away. Same estate, same people, same old game. But this year I had a truck in the driveway and a secret in the glove box, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to give. I parked the Raptor at Dad's place the day before the barbecue, thinking that maybe a private delivery would mean a private thank you. It wasn't much, just a quiet moment where he might say, "Good job, Al. I'm proud of you." That's all I'd wanted since I was a kid. But the moment I stepped out of the truck, he was already there on the porch, arms folded across his chest like he was evaluating a new piece of equipment. He looked at the Raptor the same way he'd looked at the new siding last year, like he had to find the flaws before he could let himself like it. "Cost you a fortune," he said. No smile, no warmth, just that flat voice that had always felt like a test. "It's fine," I said quickly. "Got a good deal, and things are looking up at work. Just signed on with a national freight company. Big contract." "National, huh?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "Guess that's where the money's going." I forced a laugh. "Yeah, well, I wanted you to have it. You've always talked about real trucks, so I thought. He cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand. Looks like you're showboating, Al. These things aren't cheap. Don't go buying status symbols just to prove something. My gut clenched, but I kept my face calm. It's not like that, Dad. It's a Father's Day gift. Just wanted you to have something nice. He grunted. You know what I like, Al? Hard work, not gifts, not handouts. He turned his gaze back to the truck, running his hand along the side mirror like he was inspecting it for scratches. I'll park it out back, he said finally. No need for people to see it front and center. That stung more than I wanted to admit. The driveway was practically empty, but he was already talking about hiding it. I didn't push back. I just handed him the spare keys and said, It's yours now. He took them without a word and walked off to move the truck around back. I stood there for a second, feeling like I'd just been dismissed from a job site. That night, I called my buddy Ray. He was one of the only people who'd ever really known what it was like to have a dad who measured your worth by the size of your shadow. He didn't even thank you? Ray said, his voice crackling through the speaker. What the hell, man? I sighed, leaning back in the worn leather chair in my office. Nope. He said I was showboating, called it a waste of money. Christ, Al, take the damn keys back. Guy never deserved them. I closed my eyes for a moment, the words hanging in the air like they were too heavy to knock down. Part of me still thinks he'll show it off at the barbecue, I said finally. You know how he is, loves the spotlight when it's on him. Ray let out a low whistle. You really think he'll stand up there and say he bought it himself? Like it was his idea all along? I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We both knew that was exactly what he'd do. The next morning, I woke up early and couldn't go back to sleep. My mind kept replaying that conversation on the porch, his tone, the way he took the keys without a word of thanks. I'd grown up around that kind of silence, that feeling that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. By the time the sun came up, I'd already decided I wouldn't say another word about the truck. If he wanted to pretend it was his, fine. I was done playing the good son, done trying to earn something that was never coming. Still, a small part of me couldn't help but hope he'd at least show it off. Maybe he'd stand there at the grill tomorrow, bragging about the truck like he'd always bragged about his own big purchases. Maybe I'd see a flicker of pride in his eyes. But in the back of my mind, I could already hear Ray's voice. He didn't thank you because he doesn't see you, Al. He never did. I didn't want to believe it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was probably true. I showed up the next afternoon in a button-down shirt and fresh shave, pretending I hadn't spent the whole morning in front of the mirror, rehearsing lines in my head. Dad's estate looked exactly the same as it did every year. Perfectly trimmed hedges, American flags fluttering from the porch, the smell of barbecue smoke already filling the air. The Raptor was parked front and center in the driveway, polished up like it was the guest of honor. My breath caught when I saw it. Part of me felt a flicker of pride. At least he hadn't tucked it away in the back. But then I caught sight of him, standing near the tailgate with a beer in hand, laughing with one of his buddies. Sometimes you gotta treat yourself, he was saying, loud enough for everyone around to hear. Hard work pays off. You work your ass off, you get to play a little. I stopped a few feet away, just out of the circle of handshakes and backslaps. My sister Danny came over, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her eyes soft with worry. He's been showing off the truck all morning, she said in a low voice, slipping her arms around my waist in a quick hug. You okay? I forced a smile, nodding. Yeah. Just funny to see him taking all the credit, you know? She sighed. He's always been like this, Al. You don't need to let it get to you. I didn't say anything. My hands were already inching toward my pocket where I'd slipped the envelope with the DNA results. It felt like it was burning a hole right through the fabric, like it wanted to jump out and end the charade right then and there. But I held back. For now. I wandered over to the grill, trying to blend in. Mason was there, manning the tongs like he was born to it. My younger brother, Dad's golden child, the one who could do no wrong. His roofing company was struggling, but you'd never know it from the way Dad slapped him on the back every few minutes. Look at this guy, Dad said to one of his friends, pointing at Mason like he was the goddamn mayor. Runs a real business. knows what it means to get your hands dirty. Mason flashed me a grin. Hey, Al, grab a plate? I nodded, keeping my voice light. Smells great, Mason. Dad didn't even look at me. He just kept flipping burgers, the sweat glistening on his forehead as he talked about supply costs and lumber prices like they were gospel. I stood there, listening to him spin the same stories he always did, how he started with nothing, how he built everything he had with his own two hands. Meanwhile, I was standing there with my hands jammed in my pockets, trying to keep from blurting out the truth, that it wasn't just his blood that ran cold, it was the blood that ran in me too. Or didn't, as it turned out. As the afternoon wore on, the Raptor became the star of the show. Old friends stopped by to admire it, leaning against the hood and asking Dad about the engine, the tires, the trim. And every time he'd puff out his chest and say, "Yeah, she's a beauty. You work hard, you get to enjoy the good stuff." Not a word about how I'd given it to him, not a single nod in my direction. At one point, Danny pulled me aside again, her eyes scanning my face like she was reading a map. "You sure you're okay, Al? You look like you're ready to explode." I let out a breath. "I'm fine, just tired of pretending this doesn't bother me." She gave me a sympathetic squeeze on the arm. "You've done more than enough for him, more than any of us. Don't let him take that away." I watched Dad as he moved from guest to guest, laughing and bragging, holding court like he always did. And with every word, every handshake, I felt that envelope in my pocket grow heavier. He didn't see me. He never had. And maybe, just maybe, this was the year I was finally done trying to be seen. Inside, the air was cooler. Too cool, actually, from Dad's ancient window unit rattling in the corner. We all crowded around the big oak table he'd built himself back in the 80s. He was in his element, telling stories about job sites he'd run in the city, while Mason nodded along like a faithful echo. Danny and I sat at the far end, a little apart from the rest of them. I could feel her watching me, like she was waiting for me to stand up and say something. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. Dad launched into one of his favorite stories about how he'd once outbid a rival contractor for a big highway expansion job. His hands moved like they always did, chopping the air to mark each point. "And that's real value," he said, turning to Mason. "Property. Concrete. That's what builds a legacy. You can't move a warehouse the way you can move numbers in a spreadsheet, Al." He didn't even look at me when he said it, but everyone heard it. I took a sip of my drink, the ice clinking against the glass as I swallowed down the bitter taste in my mouth. "Actually," I said carefully, "I just finished a freight optimization system that cut 22% off national shipping costs. That's real value, too." Dad blinked, like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. "That's logistics, Al. It's not real." My face burned, but I didn't let it show. I just nodded and took another drink. Mason shifted in his seat, uncomfortable but silent. Then Dad raised his glass. "To Mason," he said, his voice full and sure. "That's the kind of instinct that makes this family what it is. Kemp blood, running true." Mason grinned, ducking his head like he was embarrassed. I just stared at my glass, my mind going blank for a second. Kemp blood. The words echoed in my head, rattling around like loose change. But I knew the truth, the cold fact that I'd been carrying in my glove box for months. That blood, it never ran in me. And maybe that's why I never fit the mold. Why every attaboy felt forced, like he was playing a part he didn't really believe. I looked up and caught Danny watching me, her brow furrowed in that worried way she had. I forced a small smile, trying to tell her it was fine. But inside, I felt like I was 2 seconds away from shattering. The conversation moved on. Dad told another story about Mason's roofing jobs. How he'd taken on a project that no one else wanted. How he'd made something out of nothing. Everyone nodded along, laughing at the right parts, smiling at the familiar beats. Meanwhile, I sat there with my third drink, feeling the cold glass in my hand and the even colder truth in my chest. That's when I heard him say it. He was talking to one of his old friends, a guy named Pete who'd known him since high school. He leaned in close, his voice low but carrying. "Alan, he's always been eager," Dad said. "Guess that's what happens when you're trying to prove you belong." The words landed like a punch to the gut. I turned to look at him, my vision tunneling for a second. He wasn't even looking at me. He was just shaking his head like he was talking about some stranger he'd never quite figured out. For a moment, I thought about that envelope in my glove box, about how easy it would be to stand up, walk out to my truck, and bring it back in, drop it on the table like a bomb, and let it blow up everything. But I didn't move. I just sat there, my fingers wrapped so tight around my glass I thought it might shatter. And that's when it hit me. The reason he never saw me. The reason I'd spent my whole life feeling like I was just a guest at his table, not a son. He didn't see me because I wasn't his. And deep down, I think he'd always known. Later that evening, I slipped out to the patio for a moment to catch my breath. The night had settled in, the air thick with the smell of charcoal and spilled beer. I could still hear Dad's laughter booming from inside, the same hollow sound he'd used to fill any silence that made him uncomfortable. Mason found me there, leaning against the railing and staring out at the dark yard. He had that serious look he always got when he was about to say something he didn't want to say. "Al," he said quietly, "I heard you asking Mom about her college days the other night. What's that about?" I kept my gaze on the yard, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Just curious, that's all." "Curious," he repeated, his voice tightening. "You know how Dad is. Don't start stirring shit up just because you're feeling left out." I turned to look at him then. Mason was taller than me by an inch and broader, but he looked like a kid in that moment, trying to stand in for a father who had never needed anyone's defense. "I'm not stirring anything up," I said evenly. "I'm just done pretending everything's fine when it's not." His jaw flexed. "Just don't mess with the family's flow, okay? It's been working fine." "Fine for who?" I shot back, my voice sharper than I meant. "For him? For you? 'Cause it sure as hell never worked for me." Mason didn't say anything. He just turned and walked back inside, his shoulders stiff. I stayed there a minute longer, feeling the weight of every year I'd spent playing nice. Every birthday, every holiday, every forced laugh around that dinner table, all of it suddenly felt like it was pressing down on my chest. I walked back through the house, past the laughter and the clinking of glasses, and out to the driveway where the raptor sat, gleaming under the security light. My fingers found the edge of the glove box, the envelope still there like a live wire. For a second, I hesitated. The air smelled like grilled meat and cheap beer. The sounds of the party muffled behind me. My whole life, I'd wanted one thing from that man, to see me, to acknowledge me, to just say, "Good job, Al." But all he'd ever given me was silence and half-truths, and I'd had enough. I pulled out the envelope and held it in my hand. The weight of it felt different now, not just paper, but everything I'd carried for years. A lifetime of being second best, of being the guy who paid for the truck but never got the credit. Inside the house, I heard Dad's voice at the grill, loud and sure. "Hard work gets you things," he said, his tone dripping with finality. "Not handouts, not gifts." My hands tightened around the envelope. In that moment, I realized something that should have been obvious all along. I didn't owe him another moment of my silence. I didn't plan to make a scene. I didn't plan to turn the night into a war zone. But damn if I wasn't done staying quiet. I turned back to the house, the envelope clutched tight in my hand, and took a deep breath. Because the truth wasn't that I didn't belong. The truth was that he knew I didn't, all along. The dining room was buzzing with laughter and the clatter of forks on plates when I walked back in. I took my seat at the end of the table, the envelope burning a hole in my hand. I waited until everyone was halfway into their pulled pork and potato salad before I finally stood up. Dad looked at me, one eyebrow raised like he couldn't decide if he was annoyed or curious. "Something to say, Al?" he asked, his tone dripping with that smug amusement he reserved for my little speeches. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You called me a loser in front of your friends," I said, my voice calm and even. "Now read this and find out why I was never enough for you." I placed the envelope dead center on the picnic table, the brown paper stark against the faded tablecloth. For a second, nobody moved. The laughter and chatter died like someone had flipped a switch. Dad reached for it slowly, his fingers deliberate. He opened it, his eyes scanning the paper inside. I watched his face shift from confusion to realization to something like fear. His mouth fell open, the color draining from his face. The silence in the room was suffocating. Nobody dared to move. Even Mason looked like he'd been turned to stone. "What is this?" Dad finally rasped, his voice thin and shaky. I didn't flinch. The truth, I said. DNA test. 99.999%. Not your son. A fork clattered to the floor. Danny covered her mouth with both hands. Mom's eyes were wide and wet, like she'd seen a ghost. Dad just sat there, holding the paper like it was a death sentence. This isn't real, he said, his voice breaking. This is bullshit. It's real, I said softly. And you knew it. Maybe not in your head, but you knew it in your gut. That's why you never saw me. That's why I never fit. He opened his mouth again, but no words came out. Behind him, someone's glass slipped from their hand and shattered on the floor, the sharp crack of breaking glass slicing through the thick silence. I didn't wait for anyone to speak. I turned, my feet moving before I could even think. I walked out of that house, out of that room, full of secrets and shame and half-truths, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. Behind me, I heard Danny's voice, a shaky whisper. All. I didn't turn back. I didn't want to see the wreckage. I'd spent my whole life cleaning up after that man's messes, patching up the gaps in his love with blind hope and desperate efforts. No more. As I reached the door, I heard glass breaking again. It was Dad's voice that cut through the chaos. Raw, desperate, like a wounded animal. But I didn't care. I walked out into the night, the warm air wrapping around me like a promise. The truth was out now. Let him choke on it. Let him finally understand what it felt like to be invisible, to be ignored. The man who'd spent my whole life calling me small was now the one left in pieces. And I was done being the one to glue it all back together. I climbed into the Raptor, the spare key I'd had made weeks ago already warm in my pocket. I started the engine, the deep rumble cutting through the quiet night. I made sure to pull away slow enough that everyone inside would hear it. The growl of the truck he'd claimed as his own, the truck I'd paid for and was now taking back. Halfway down the street, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Dad stumbled out of the house, papers clutched in his hand, his voice muffled by the closed windows. He was shouting something I couldn't make out, something that didn't matter anymore. I merged onto the main road, his voice disappearing behind me, drowned out by the steady hum of the V6 engine and the roaring in my own chest. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. 11 missed calls already, most of them from Danny and Mom. I didn't answer any of them. I didn't need to hear more excuses or explanations. I drove straight to a hotel near the George Washington Bridge, a cheap place I'd stayed at before during late-night work trips. I pulled into the parking lot and shut off the engine. My hands were still shaking as I checked in, but my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. Inside the room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. More missed calls, more messages. Danny's name again and again. Mom's number flashing like an alarm. I turned the phone off and set it on the nightstand. For the first time, the silence felt like a friend instead of an enemy. The old man might have built a fortune, but I'd just bought my freedom. When I woke up the next morning, there was a text waiting for me. It was from Mom. "He's not your father, but I am your mother. Can we talk?" I stared at the message, my breath catching in my chest. Part of me wanted to delete it, to throw the phone across the room and never think about any of them again. But another part of me, the part that still believed in something bigger than anger, held on to it. Because I might have lost a father that night. But I wasn't ready to lose everything else. I didn't respond right away. I just let the words sit there, a small promise that maybe, just maybe, some pieces of my life were worth saving. And as I looked out the hotel window at the highway stretching out into the distance, I realized something I should have seen all along. I wasn't leaving my family behind. I was finally leaving behind the lie. A week later, I drove to Newark, hands sweaty on the wheel. I'd found Tom Gaines' name on the last page of the DNA report, a name that meant everything and nothing all at once. He was a retired aerospace engineer, lived alone in a modest ranch house on the edge of the city. I pulled up to his place and just sat there for a minute, the engine idling. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Fireworks, tears, maybe a hug I didn't know I needed. But when Tom opened the door, he looked calm, like he'd been waiting for this moment his whole life. "Alan, right?" he said, his voice steady but gentle. "Come in." The living room was small but neat, filled with old flight manuals and framed photos of him in front of aircraft prototypes. I sat down on the worn sofa, my heart still pounding. He poured us both coffee from an old percolator and settled into the armchair across from me. "I wasn't sure you'd want to meet," he said quietly. "I didn't even know about you. Your mother never told me." I swallowed hard. "She didn't tell me either, not until last week." He nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I'm sorry for that. I would have stepped up if I'd known. I always wanted kids." We sat there in silence for a moment, the coffee cooling in our hands. Then he asked me about my life, what I did for a living, if I had any kids of my own. I told him about my supply chain business, about the contract I'd just closed. His eyes lit up a little. "You built that from nothing?" he asked. "That's damn impressive." I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't much, just a few words, a tone that was different from anything I'd ever gotten from Carl. But it was enough. We didn't hug, we didn't cry, we just talked. About sports, about work, about how neither of us liked the way they'd changed the coffee at Dunkin' since the 90s. It was easy, simple, like I was finally breathing air that didn't come with a price tag. At the end of the visit, Tom stood and went to a bookshelf. He pulled down a photo in a cracked silver frame, a picture of my mom from college, hair long and wild, laughing at something just out of frame. "I never stopped wondering what happened to her," he said softly. "She had a way of lighting up a room, even when she didn't mean to." I took the photo from him, my hands shaking a little. In that moment, I realized something I'd never let myself believe before. I wasn't the sum of Carl Kemp's silence or the weight of his judgment. I was my own man. And maybe, for the first time in my life, I wasn't alone in that. Tom walked me to the door and gave my shoulder a light squeeze. "Let's do this again sometime," he said. "No rush, no pressure, just whenever you're ready." As I walked back to the truck, the warm sun on my face, I felt lighter than I had in years. I wasn't sure where this new bond would go or what it would mean. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. Sometimes it ain't the blood that matters, it's the tone when they say your name. And for once, that tone was warm and real. Thanksgiving rolled around faster than I expected. Normally, I'd have driven up to Albany and watched Dad carve the turkey while Mason bragged about his latest job and Danny played peacemaker. But this year, I didn't even bother RSVPing. Instead, I spent Thanksgiving at Danny's place in Hoboken. She invited me without a second thought. Her and her husband, her kids running around in mismatched socks, laughter filling every corner of the tiny kitchen. It felt real, messy and loud, but real. The night before, Mom called me. Her voice was soft, hesitant, like she was testing the waters. "Alan, your father, he said he's not coming if you're going to be there." I didn't even hesitate. "That's his choice," I said, my tone calm and final. Over pumpkin pie at Danny's table, she leaned over and studied my face for a second. "You look lighter, Al," she said, almost like it surprised her, like you dropped a weight you carried too long. I didn't know how to explain it, but she wasn't wrong. I felt like I'd finally put down a burden I'd been hauling around since I was old enough to understand that I'd never measure up to Carl Kemp's standards. Later that night, after the dishes were stacked in the sink and the kids were asleep, I checked my phone. One new text. It was from Dad. "You've made your point. Don't contact me again." I stared at it for a second, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then I deleted it without even reading the rest. The man had erased me in life. Now I was erasing him back. For the first time in years, I didn't feel that gnawing ache in my chest, the one that always showed up after holidays with family, the one that said, "You'll never be enough." Because sitting there with Danny, talking about the best way to roast Brussels sprouts and watching her husband pour another glass of wine, I realized I didn't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. Dad's final message didn't hurt me. It freed me. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, feet up, a cold beer in my hand. Danny's husband and I watched old movies, the kind of dumb comedies you can't help but laugh at, even when you're tired. When I finally went to bed, I slept straight through the night. No phone calls, no demands. No more pressure to be a son to a man who never saw me. It turns out family doesn't have to be defined by blood or by old expectations. It can be defined by who you show up for and who shows up for you. And that was enough for me. 6 months later, I sold the Raptor, got a decent chunk of change for it, enough to seed an expansion of my firm into the Midwest. I used to think I needed that truck to prove something to Dad, like it was my last chance to earn a nod of respect I'd never get. Turns out, I didn't need his respect to build something that mattered. I talk to Tom once a week now. Nothing heavy, just honest. He asks about the new branch, how the kids at Danny's place are doing, whether I'm still making time for fishing. We laugh about how neither of us knows the first thing about fishing, but that it doesn't stop us from pretending we're experts. Mom and I meet for lunch once a month. It's awkward. No grand confessions or easy forgiveness, but it's honest. And for the first time in my life, that's enough. I haven't heard a single word from Carl since Thanksgiving. And the weirdest part, I'm finally okay with that. I used to think that silence was the worst kind of punishment, but now it just feels like peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing I don't have to keep twisting myself into someone else's definition of a son. Work's been good, better than it's ever been. My team's thriving, the Midwest branch is already turning a profit, and I find myself actually looking forward to Monday mornings. Funny how once you let go of old ghosts, the rest of your life starts to flow a little smoother too. One evening, after a long day at the office, I was sitting in my car staring out at the lights of Jersey City. My phone buzzed with a text from Danny. "You coming over for dinner this weekend? The kids miss you." I texted back right away. Wouldn't miss it. Funny how silence can be peaceful when it comes from the right people. I used to think I was the one trying to fit in. Turns out they were the ones trying to keep me out. And I'm done letting them. I'm done letting anyone tell me who I'm supposed to be or where I belong. Because now I know exactly where I stand, on my own, on solid ground, with no apologies left to make. I started from nothing and built a business I'm proud of. I started from nothing and found a new family in the one person I never expected, Tom. And I started from nothing and found out that maybe nothing isn't a bad place to begin as long as you're the one building it. And that's where I'll stay, grounded, steady, and finally free.